Prime Minister Mark Carney signed an MOU with Alberta to build a pipeline to the west coast of Canada. And this is raising the question of whether he's a political chessmaster or a climate sellout. Green Party leader Elizabeth May says she feels betrayed after supporting Carney's budget for him offering tax credits for enhanced oil recovery in the MOU with Alberta. And Stephen Jabot, one of his own cabinet ministers, resigned from cabinet over this as well. There were high expectations of Carney on the climate file due to his climate credentials, but upon taking office, he killed the carbon tax, paused EV mandates, and has offered a raft of environmental concessions to Alberta Premier Danielle Smith in the MOU. What's going on here? Is Carney selling out the environment, or is he playing a long game? To explore this, we contacted Max Fawcett, climate columnist with the National Observer, to dive beneath the headlines. Here's our full interview with Max Fawcett as we explore Mark Carney's long game. So let's start with introductions. I'll get you to do a self-introduction. Tell me who you are, what you do, and what you're all about.
Sure. My name is Max Fawcett. I'm the lead columnist for Canada's National Observer, former magazine editor, former Alberta Climate Change Office employee, fan of good climate policy, and student of the path that we're on right now, I suppose.
Or not on, as the case may be.
Yes, indeed.
Max, a number of really prominent people are dissing Prime Minister Mark Carney these days for throwing climate change under the bus. You could say he's navigating the political turmoil of the world, and that's pretty true, I guess. But Mark Carney has quite a history of engagement with climate change, and I'm sure that has led to some high expectations for him to act. So let's begin. Before we get into the analysis, let's begin with his climate credentials. Where do they come from?
I mean, they come from mostly his time as the governor of the Bank of Canada, and especially the Bank of England. There's this famous speech he gave in 2015 where he talked about what he described as the tragedy of the commons of climate policy. And he was one of the first people to really elevate the risks that were being created by climate change to the financial sector, to the financial markets. He accepts the science of climate change. Greenhouse gas emissions make the world warmer and more dangerous. But what he was saying was, in addition to all the impacts on human populations, there's also a huge risk to our financial system. And folks in his world were very mindful of that coming out of the financial crisis in 2008, 2009 in the United States. With the housing sector there, they were really trying to find where are the other systemic risks in our financial system? Where's the next black swan going to come from? And his argument was the next black swan is going to come from climate change, that it is going to, if we don't prepare for it, if companies are not adequately investing in a low carbon future, it's going to create systemic risks through the banking system, through the insurance system. And ultimately, governments will have to bail those industries out, just as they did in the financial crisis of 08-09. So, that really kind of put him on the map as someone who thought about climate change. I think in a way that was complementary to a lot of the existing thinking about it. The science, the need to take this stuff seriously, and he was sort of adding a financial economic argument that hadn't really been there before, and it's one that he advanced afterwards. He went and did some work for the United Nations. He headed up a sort of a climate disclosure task force. His big push was trying to get these companies, whether they're oil and gas producers, banks, insurance companies, get them to disclose the risks of climate change the same way they disclose the other material risks in their businesses. Disclose them to shareholders, and just get them to start thinking about them and how to manage them. And I think he was pretty successful on that front. There was a point where, the organization that he was heading basically spoke for companies that had a combined, I think it was like $8 trillion in assets under management. Like it was basically every major player in the financial sector globally was part of his endeavor. But we've kind of seen that disappear over the last 12 months under the pressure of the Trump administration. When push came to shove, these commitments were not held as closely as maybe they could have been.
It's funny because I do remember, I don't remember specifically the speech, but I do remember being inspired by the speech. And, it was exciting, as you note, because, hey, he's a very prominent banker in the world. And he was talking about climate change. And, people thought, wow, that's great. And I actually quoted him in many talks that I did on energy transition. I quoted his, I think he said, energy transition is the greatest investment opportunity of our lifetimes, or this generation, or something like that, which I thought was, a positive spin on taking action on climate change. So I use that in talks many times. But he's also written a book. He wrote a book called Values, with a bracket and an S and a bracket. I don't know what that means, but anyways, it's about values. There's a couple of chapters or more about climate change. In that chapter, by the way, I'll just quote you what he says. This is really interesting. He says, investment must be accelerated at a warlike pace to fight what John Kerry has termed World War Zero. So does that sound like the Mark Carney we have today? What do you think about the book? Before we get to the analysis, have you looked at the book, and what do you think of the book?
Yeah, I reviewed it for the Literary Review of Canada back in the day, and I thought it was a good book. It was at times you could tell it was being written or ghostwritten by an economist. It was definitely a love letter to markets and to capital structures being marshaled, as he saw them correctly. But I thought it was a good contribution. I also thought at the time that it very clearly signaled he was going to get involved in politics, and that was sort of my my concluding paragraph in the review. Was he had this line about how people with these values need to be willing to put them on the line. They need to be willing to make sacrifices and participate in public life. And my sort of concluding thought was, well, when is he going to do that? Because he kind of has to put his words where his money where his mouth was, and of course it turns out he did. So I see the difference between Mark Carney the writer, Mark Carney the polemicist, and Mark Carney the Prime Minister, but I also understand that it is a fundamentally different job. Your role as a writer, as a polemicist especially, is to make an argument, make a case, often as strongly as possible, and that our digital media environment right now is particularly oriented towards the most extreme version of your argument possible. That's what it rewards. As Prime Minister, you are governing a country. You have people's jobs and livelihoods depending on you, and it really is sort of the art of the possible. And what is possible in the moment we're in, especially with climate, is just a lot less than it was when he was writing that book. When John Kerry was the Secretary of State. We unfortunately are in a really difficult moment in some respects for climate policy. I mean, in other respects, I'm as optimistic as I've ever been about the pace of change, about the inevitability of change. But in North America specifically, it really does feel like we're going backwards. And I understand when folks in the climate community had that reaction to the MOU that he signed with the government of Alberta, that it felt like we were going backwards as well. I've made the argument in a couple of places that I don't actually think that's the case, but I understand the sentiment.
So what is in that MOU that we should know about if we're thinking about climate change? There's a few little nuggets in there that you don't hear people talk about.
Yeah, the pipeline stuff gets the headlines, certainly here in Alberta, and yes, it commits both governments to building another oil pipeline, 1 million barrels per day to the West Coast. The Alberta government's framing of it is much more effusive than the federal government's is. The federal government is basically saying, we'll agree if there's a private sector proponent to kind of get out of the way a little bit, but you still need to consult with the Indigenous communities along the path, and you still need to consult with the government of British Columbia. I would argue that the federal government's support or lack thereof is probably the least difficult hurdle for a new pipeline to clear, and we can get into the nuts of that more later. But the stuff that caught my eye on the climate policy side was what the federal government got Alberta to agree to. It got it to agree to a minimum effective carbon price of $130 per ton. And I think that was interpreted in some spaces as a retreat, because the federal plan signals a path to $170 per ton. But the language is important there because it didn't say price of 130. It said a credit price. And the policy nerds that I've talked to or listened to in the days and week or so since have said basically a credit price of $130 per ton is the same as the headline price of $170 per ton. And that's especially important in Alberta because right now, thanks, of course, to the government of Alberta's deliberate behavior, the effective credit price in Alberta is under $20 a ton. They froze the headline at $95 a ton, but the credits are clearing under $20 a ton. That's what the real carbon price is, and that is untenable. It's untenable for companies trying to make plans for decarbonization. It's untenable for attracting low carbon capital to this province, this country, and it's untenable for the Pathways project, which the government of Alberta claims it wants to see built. So the Carney government, the Carney team has focused, I think, on the right part of it. I'm not sure that the nuances will register with most people. I think that is probably a good thing in terms of getting good climate policy implemented. I think it's so complicated that it may just kind of fly under or over the radar. But that's the key of it. Carney has always believed, he's always been a believer in the importance of the industrial carbon price, far more than I think the Trudeau government was, because they surrounded the industrial price with all these other policies. And what Carney has done here is essentially said, I'll trade away the clean electricity standard, I'll trade away the oil and gas emissions cap for a properly functioning industrial carbon price, which, by the way, if you look at the research done by Blake Schaefer, Andrew Leach, economists here in Alberta, if you look at Clean Prosperity in Toronto, they all say getting the industrial carbon price, the credit price to $130 per ton makes the emissions cap and the clean electricity standard kind of unnecessary. It does almost all the work there. You really don't need both. On the electricity side, I think the Clean Prosperity report said an industrial credit price of $130 per ton will deliver 3 times as many emissions reductions in Alberta as the clean electricity standard. So he's focused on, I think, the right part. It looks like he's surrendering a lot of other policies to get there, but it should net us out in the same or better place.
So just staying on the MOU, I know in his nation-building projects, there's a few things that don't get a lot of attention there as well. One, there's a couple of grid tie projects that are in there. Wasn't grid tie mentioned in the Alberta MOU as well?
It was. So they both talk about this intertie in between BC and Alberta. I think they have very different ideas of what it's for. It is spun as being for, artificial intelligence, decarbonizing oil and gas, in the Alberta presentation of it. And I think from the federal government's perspective, that's fine. If they think that's what it's going to be for and it gets them to a point where they can sell it, good enough. Because once that expanded intertie between BC and Alberta is in place, it's still going to do the work, the climate folks in Alberta have long talked about, which is pairing BC's hydro with Alberta's wind and making Alberta's wind much, much more economical. BC can buy the wind when it's cheap, and we can buy their hydro, when we need it, and really kind of firm up the clean parts. Not as much of their grid. They really just get access to lower priced electrons, but we get the ability to firm up our wind, which in an environment where the government isn't actively obstructing it would be a huge thing. And I wonder to what extent it improves the prospects of new wind in Alberta. The stupid U corridors are still going to be there, but we get a different provincial government. All of a sudden, that big piece, the intertie is in place, and we can go to work. So I think that's a bigger deal than it's being made out to be. And look, even if it's used to decarbonize oil and gas, that's not a bad thing. It's probably not the most optimal use of that intertie, but it's not a bad thing. And it's not a hill that I think the Fed should be trying to die on. So, that's a big piece. And the other big piece in there, and I think this probably only registers with people who are neck deep in climate policy wonkery, is the mention of financial instruments being used to backstop the industrial carbon price. Because I've seen a lot of skepticism, understandable, on social media saying, well, what's to stop the Alberta government from walking away from the industrial carbon price down the road? Or what's to stop, a different federal government from just getting rid of it altogether? And what's to stop them is these financial mechanisms. I think they're talking about carbon contracts for difference. Again, this is getting super wonky, but basically, insurance on these big decarbonization projects where if you're building carbon capture, if you're doing some other form of business that relies on a higher industrial carbon price, now you have a financial insurance contract. And if a government walks away from it in the future, they have to pay the cost. You don't, right? You are locking in your price. And that, I think, is going to be a deterrent to future governments. If they have to spend, or if they have to realize a $5 billion cost on their balance sheet, a $10 billion cost because they decided to, virtue signal to their anti-carbon pricing voters, that's a lot less attractive, right? There is a cost being attached to it. And I think that is another piece of the MOU that maybe isn't getting as much attention as it should, in large part because I don't think either the Alberta government or especially the feds want to spook people, on Danielle Smith's right about what is actually happening.
It's interesting because, grid interties are often listed by the electricity folks as one of the top 3 things you can do to help make the grid more robust and more friendly to renewable energy, et cetera, et cetera. And a carbon price is super important as well. The consumer carbon price obviously had political problems, even though it was probably much better a way of doing it, much fairer way of doing it. The problem with the industrial price, of course, has been the shell games you can play. We've been bragging about our carbon price in Alberta since the Klein days. And, you might have said it was a number, but it would never reach the nameplate number that they gave you because of all the little loopholes all over the place. So is Carney on the right track here? Is he playing a long game? Is this guy a chess master or a sellout? You listen to Stephen Guilbeault, who quit his cabinet, Elizabeth May, they're condemning him roundly. They're not giving him any credit for any long-term strategy here. What's your analysis? Is he a sellout or a chess master?
I would definitely put him at closer to chessmaster, although I'm reluctant to give that designation to any politician. I think one of the key differences here is the Trudeau government was very good at making announcements, very good at implementing policies, very bad at defending them, and very bad at doing the kind of spade work that was required to make them popular with the public. And what it looks to me like Carney is doing here is he's identified the mechanism that will attract the least political blowback from the public. And then he's going to work on defending it from any future attacks. If you can get the government of Danielle Smith to not just agree to an effective price of $130 a ton, but put its own money behind it, that is a lot more political cover than the Trudeau government had for any of its climate policies. It makes it much more difficult for a future Conservative government to go after it, and then you have the financial mechanisms on top of it. So I think he is trying to support the policy he believes in most with the political capital that he has to work with. And whether that works or not is an open question. But I think it probably couldn't work less well than what the Trudeau government did. And I include, Guilbeault in that. Guilbeault, the clean electricity standards are a really good example. He was talking about how, we're losing all these emissions reductions. To believe that the clean electricity standard would give you those reductions, you basically have to believe that the Conservatives are never going to form a federal government until 2045, which is when the clean electricity standard really starts to bind on all gas production. I don't think Pierre Poilievre's a very good politician, but I don't think they're going to be out of power for another 20 years. I think they will form government in the next decade. And so that policy doesn't really exist. It exists on paper. It exists as a potential risk for generators. But, politically, it's kind of already a dead policy walking. And Carney is trading it for a policy that may have a chance of surviving. You and I were both in Alberta on, watching the NDP implement really good climate policies under the Climate Leadership Plan. Really smart, really thoughtful, really well sort of articulated. And the ECP came in and wiped most of them out, right? A climate policy is only as good as its ability to survive a change in government. I believe that more firmly now than I ever have. And I think that is sort of one of the things that is informing Carney's approach here as well. If climate policy can't survive a change in government, it does not have the effects that it is supposed to have. And so we'll see. We'll see eventually, whenever the Conservatives get their shit together, if the industrial carbon price survives. But I can promise you, the emissions cap wouldn't, the clean electricity standard wouldn't, all the other things that some folks are mourning wouldn't have any hope of surviving a change in government.
You know, it's funny. I just interviewed Michael Liebreich, the founder of Bloomberg New Energy Finance, a couple of times. One on his pragmatic climate reset, which I am super intrigued by. Like, some of the ideas in there just ring so true for the times. And, you know, his top priorities are to change the politics of climate change, to depolarize it, to, you know, take the heat off it, quit scaring people. And, you know, he says people are just worried about their jobs and their homes and their, you know, so if they lash out at climate policy, it's because, you know, maybe from the Trudeau era when they were throwing it in their face and threatening to take away their cars and this and that and the other thing, it gave them a flashpoint to do that. So what Michael says is to depolarize it. It sounds like even he, though, by the way, is skeptical about Carney. Like, I heard him in his podcast and he's a little skeptical about what's going on. He didn't talk about it. I'd love to hear his thoughts on it. But anyways, so Carney's stuck in this, not stuck, but the cards he's been dealt are the crisis du jour, you know, the trade wars, inflation, affordability crises, political turmoil. So how do you think he's navigating this? Where's it all going? And can he survive? Because, you know, without making the sexy announcements, he doesn't get any of those accolades that Trudeau was so good at getting, at least from, you know, enough of the public that kept him in office. Can he survive, and will it work?
Well, that is the $1 million question. You know, you're right that the Trudeau government was very good at winning the support of the climate community. I'm not sure that it helped them all that much at the polls. You know, Mark Carney, like I said, his first act in government was slashing the signature consumer carbon price, and that didn't seem to hurt him in BC. Didn't seem to hurt him in Quebec. He did very, very well. I think better than Trudeau in both of those provinces in the last election. I am sure there is a cost that Carney will pay in some parts of BC for this decision. Although, you know, I think if you polled it now and you polled it in 6 months, you'd see some pretty different results. But even polling it now, it's just not showing that big of an impact. You know, there is some wiggle in the Lower Mainland, but it is a popular decision, more than 2-1 in Ontario. It is a popular decision, more than 2-1 nationally. I think people are just more concerned right now about our national sovereignty, our sort of independence from the Americans, and our jobs. You know, we are sort of down on a lower tier of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and the climate stuff has kind of always resided on a higher level. I think that's one of the reasons, one of the challenges in the politics of it. I agree completely with Michael Liebrecht on finding ways to depolarize and depoliticize climate policy, to make climate policy kind of interchangeable with cost of living policy. You know, that it's really about getting access to cheaper, better energy, not changing lifestyles, not just transitions. You know, I understand where people are coming from on that stuff, but a lot of people don't want to be justly transitioned. They want to continue doing what it is that they're doing. And all the best wishes and well-meaning sort of thoughts in the world won't change that. And so reframing climate policy as a cost of living issue, I think there has a lot of juice in it. And I think that is sort of the direction where Carney is probably going to try to go here. He is not going to make grandiose statements about you know, rewiring the Canadian economy and reorienting how we do business. I think he understands exactly where the path of travel is globally. You know, he knows what's happening in China. He knows what's happening in most parts of the world. He especially knows what's happening in Europe. But he also knows that he can't say that stuff out loud right now. in the way that he might if he was an author or he was even a governor of the Bank of Canada, because people will get spooked. And he needs to, more than anything, win a majority. He needs to win a majority so he has 4 years to do work. And I think with a majority government, and not like a one-seat majority, but a comfortable majority, he would see some interesting stuff out of a Carney government. He would still continue down the road of industrial carbon pricing, but I think he would surround it with the kind of rhetoric and the kind of sort of acknowledgement of the path of travel that a lot of climate people want. What they're worried about, and I get it, is they don't really know where he stands right now. And the problem is he can't say it.
Like, that takes incredible
Yep.
discipline. Who could not stand up when being confronted, if he truly does believe in climate action, who could stand up and facing all the crap storm coming at him from the climate folks and not say anything? Like, that's discipline.
Yeah. I think he showed, though, for a guy who kind of had the billing of not being a natural politician the way Trudeau was, he's pretty good at politics. The thing with Trump where, he said that Trump was a transformative president, and everyone in the world understood what he was saying, except Donald Trump, who thought he was being nice to him, right? He has that gift of being able to communicate his position to the people who are aware without giving the game away to the people maybe who are a little less aware. And I think that's a great political talent. I think it's one he will probably deploy on climate many, many times over the next weeks and months, where he will signal to the climate community that, like, he knows where things are going. He understands the challenge Canada faces, but he also understands that he has to win an election and a majority, or else we're going to go way, way backwards on this stuff, the way the Americans are, a complete gutting of national climate infrastructure. And, I've heard some folks suggest that the MOU could have been signed by Pierre Poilievre. Not a chance. Pierre Poilievre would never have put his name on $130 per ton effective industrial carbon price. He just wouldn't. Folks need to disabuse themselves of that idea that he and Poilievre are walking the same path on climate. They are not.
And this is where it gets puzzling, though. Just to backstep on to the MOU for a second, sure. If our analysis of Carney's action there is that there's some good that can come out of that, long-term good. Let's run with that assumption. What's Danielle Smith thinking, and why is she so happy?
Yeah, her end of the bargain is a little harder for me to figure out. I mean, she's painted herself into this corner where, her party is 50 to 75% separatist. And that's not me saying that. That's her own party president estimating that. And she has really kind of amped them up about how evil Canada is and how the federal government is trying to take away your livelihood. And I think there's a part of her that maybe realizes she went too far. That she might have baked that bread in the oven a little too long, and is trying to walk it back to a safer place. I think she also genuinely believes that she can get a pipeline built. Like, I think her view of global energy markets is the same as OPEC's, that demand is going to grow unchecked until the 2050s, and there will be an additional million barrels, frankly, 2 million barrels per day of demand that Alberta can satisfy. I don't think that's even close to true. I suspect you don't either. But I think where the Carney people come from on that is, let her believe that, right? Let her prove herself wrong, rather than the federal government being the one that always has to play the bad guy and always gets hurt politically for it. I hear my friends in Quebec and BC talking about the risks there. I also see the reward of having more Alberta MPs who aren't conservative. I think that would be very beneficial to our country, to have a few more voices from this province that are reasonable about the relationship between Alberta and Ottawa. And so, when we talk about national unity, I think, and maybe I'll get in trouble for this, but I think every Liberal MP and every New Democrat in Alberta is worth 3 or 4 in Ontario and BC. And maybe Mark Carney, who is a native son of Alberta, understands the importance of that as well.
So let's end up with your final analysis on Mark Carney, chessmaster versus sellout. Where do you think he can take this, and where would you like to see him take this? His climate action.
I mean, I think that the proof is in the pudding of the agreement on industrial carbon pricing, right? So that the MOU commits both parties to a formal agreement I believe next April, on the details of it. And I want to see those details. I want to see exactly how long it will take for us to get up to that $130 per ton floor as of a credit price. I genuinely think he's willing to trade a lot of political capital for it, because he understands that is what the Pathways project requires to get built, and he does believe in that. I'm mostly there. I understand the criticisms of carbon capture. I also understand that the IPCC says that it is a necessary part of reaching net zero. Even Guilbeault admits this, and I think judging carbon capture and storage technology on its earlier iterations is kind of an intellectual mistake, because we wouldn't do that to wind and solar. Like, wind and solar was not very efficient in its earliest iterations, and then it improved, it scaled, it got better. The same is possible for carbon capture. And so I think he believes that. He knows he needs that higher industrial carbon price to make it happen. And there's a bunch of other investments that can happen in BC and Ontario and Alberta that require a higher industrial carbon price. At the end of the day, he is an investment-minded guy, former Brookfield guy, former Bank of England, Bank of Canada. He wants to see climate policy delivered through investment, not through restrictions, not through limitations. And I would like to see more of that going forward. Let's see the details on the industrial carbon pricing. Let's see more deals, more investment, more clean energy jobs. Because again, that is a story we, as climate advocates, we want to be able to tell people is the path we say that we're going to be on is better for job creation. It's better for cost of living. It's better for your kids having good careers going forward. And we're very close to being able to tell it. In some respects, we already can. But I think it's his job to kind of push that across the line. And if he has to promise a pipeline that will never get built to do it, hey man, I think that's some pretty masterful political chess that's being played.
Mark Carney's government has certainly repealed and let lapse a whole number of important climate policies. Can you just itemize them for us?
Okay, yeah. So there's the consumer carbon tax that he got rid of in his first act as Prime Minister in April. He's promised to not implement the clean electricity standard if there's a deal, not implement the oil and gas emissions cap if there's a deal, got rid of the anti-greenwashing provisions in the most recent budget, paused the EV mandate, pending, I think, some changes to it on timelines and so forth, and then has said if there's an oil pipeline that has a private sector proponent, gets the sign-off of Indigenous communities, gets the sign-off of the government of BC, then he will either suspend or create a carve-out in the tanker ban. So I think that's 7 policies in total.
Is Greener Homes going to come back? Or yeah. I think that was a very popular and not an unwise policy.
Yeah, it's a good question. I wonder if they're going to bring back Greener Homes with the changes to the EV mandate. I think maybe it's drawing from the same pool of funding or they see it the same way. I would be highly supportive of bringing both of those back. I think the way to get people on board with climate policy, as I said earlier, is to make it seem like a better way to go about your business. So if you can get an EV for cheaper than a gas-powered vehicle, that's the whole ballgame. Because they're better cars. You and I both know that. With Greener Home stuff, you're going to do those retrofits if they save you money, and then you're going to start thinking about it in a not as a cost. Climate policy isn't a cost; it's a benefit to me. It makes me wealthier. It saves me money. I mean, that is the whole ballgame, I think, in terms of how we sell climate policy going forward. I wrote a column about this a while back, making that argument. So yeah, I would really like to see them refund those programs. I understand from the sort of pure economist perspective, those are very expensive emissions reductions. I promise you the public doesn't care. They don't care about what is the lowest cost reduction. They care about what is the highest benefit to them reduction. And that is, I think, a good way forward in terms of climate policy in this country.
Well, Max, thanks for taking the time to talk about Mark Carney. And I guess we've decided he's not a sellout. Whether he's a chessmaster or not, I guess time will tell.
I mean, I've decided he's not a sellout. Other people certainly have. But yeah, we will see in the fullness of time whether this strategy was a good idea or not.
So thanks very much, Max.
Thanks for having me.
Max Fawcett's a former oil and gas writer and editor, and the lead climate columnist with the National Observer based in Calgary, Alberta. In the fullness of time, we'll see what Prime Minister Mark Carney's climate strategy is. But for now, unlike many columnists, Fawcett is reserving judgment. If you like interviews like this or our short CKUA radio features, be sure to subscribe to our podcast. To see our library of more than 400 episodes, visit GreenEnergyFutures.ca. For Green Energy Futures, I'm David Dodge.